Okay, guys, so the next step here after a stroker kit we have to do is actually figure out his camshaft. Now, on our cylinder heads here, I'll give you guys a short drawing on our cylinder heads, on those 351 Windsor heads. Now, on that combustion chamber, we had our heads milled 20 thousandths for us to be able to get a good quench of compression to 11.8 to 1 for the hotter camshaft for us to put on without having any issues, putting up like a higher stall converter or upgraded gears to make it more of a drivable car to use every day, but still run, in this case, race gas or ethanol. Now, on this situation here, on those cylinder heads, they can get a maximum valve with upgraded valve springs of 620 thousandths inch of that lift, the valve to open in the combustion chamber of your cylinder head, 620 thousandths of an inch. So we actually milled our heads 20 thousandths. So that subtracts our clearance. So now we won't be able to have 620 thousandths. Now we only have 600 thousandths of an inch of a lift for this engine. So now the next thing we're going to do is talk about this camshaft. Now the camshaft, what it does here is I have a basic drawing of here. It's a shaft in the middle here, up above the crankshaft. They have usually a lobe with the crankshaft. That lobe lifts the push rod going to the rocker arms that presses down this valve to open the valve here for the combustion chamber for the cylinder head. Safely, like I said, at 620 thousandths of an inch, safely can lift at before the piston can have any clearance issues at flat dead center. In this situation, going from 650 thousandths of an inch for it to hit valve, for the piston to hit the valve, it'd be 650 thousandths. So I subtracted by 30 thousandths of an inch, which I do on all cylinder heads. I would recommend to have a good clearance and still be reliable. So after subtracting 20 thousandths of an inch off the cylinder heads, we're able to get a 6/10 of an inch, 600 thousandths of an inch, you say, of a lift clearance available. So what this camshaft does, right? It's a shaft in the middle. They'll have a lobe, right? The lobe goes by on the camshaft. It goes by on camshafts for every performance part, any performance gain you want to put on, as far as like a street, mild, or race performance. They go by the lift, the height of the lift, how much it opens up that valve, the height of the camshaft, how much it lifts, and the duration. How long of a time does that valve open for? So we found a camshaft that was able to. I was able to go find a camshaft that was able to get a good clearance, to have a good duration, volume of air to come in, opening the valve, and still have a good clearance to not have any piston to valve clearance. So, and that camshaft. I'm going to look over this camshaft for you guys here. The cam here is a 230 intake, 230 exhaust at 50, with a 512 intake and 512 exhaust lift at 110 LSA. This RPM level will be able to good for 2,000 to 6,000 RPM, so good mid to top end range, but still be able to use drive every day. With a 1.7 roller rocker ratio, which we have on these heads. So, what does it mean? That means at a 230 intake and 230 exhaust. So that means the lobe we have here that opens up the valve, it opens, and then since the whole circle of that shaft is 360 degrees, that means it opens for 260 degrees of the time that cam opens up the valve for the intake, and also opens up the valve in the exhaust as well at the same time as well, at same duration, at the same lift. What does it mean when you have 110 lobe LSA? Well, when you have a cam lobe on your camshaft, and it has a 260 degrees, which you're looking at the lobe separation angles is from one cam lobe to another cam lobe. You have a separation here of 110 degrees. So that means the lobe separation angle, it closes for 100 degrees of the time for the valve to close and compress the air into this combustion chamber. It keeps the valve closed. So that's pretty much it, guys. And if you guys, this camshaft, since we're using a 11.8 to 1 compression ratio, give us about 60 horses and about 40 pound-feet of torque and gains. And if you guys want to know the part number for this camshaft, I'm going to give you guys to it in a second. This camshaft, the cam part number is SRU-226-3. The whole cam kit usually comes for $700 parts for the parts and shipping, but it'll come with the camshaft, upgraded push rods, upgraded valve springs, and usually upgraded rocker arms too as well for this kit. You can go find at Summer Racing. So that's going to be the cam section. So now we have the stroker kit explained. We have the camshaft explained. Now we need to talk about is the intake manifold. Now, on the intake manifold, let's go erase this here. I'll give you guys a better view. You have your V8 engine. So there's their cylinder heads, there's their block. They'll have an intake manifold. Usually, the intake manifold, what it does is, the lower the runners are from the throttle opening for the air to come into, goes into ports for the air to come into from that throttle. Okay? In many cases, situations on these intake manifolds, the higher the height of the intake manifold, the more horsepower torque there are. The more horsepower you get, more torque you get. The lower the intake manifold, the more horsepower you get. Because the lower the intake manifold you get, you're going to be getting a shorter volume of air going in, but you're going to be able to pick up the horsepower at higher RPMs. When you run a higher intake manifold, you put a higher volume of air that gives you a better throttle response. It gives you better torque. So there's that part. So we were able to go with the intake manifold. But we also had to make sure with the ports, runners going on the intake manifold going towards cylinder heads, which we talked about in the past about porting the cylinder heads as well, since which we did here is port those stock 351 Windsor cylinder heads. The intake ports, we had to open up that gasket match these cylinder heads to match these runners. We also open up the ports as well to give a better volume of airflow, make it larger to get more airflow in from the intake manifold going to the cylinder heads. By gasket matching it, because usually they have a small, you have a gasket to install for the bolts to mount the intake manifold to the heads. Usually when they port it, they usually port match. So what they do is they start filling in, they start gasket matching to make the cylinder heads to match the gasket flow. Same thing here for the ports. It does, depending how much far you go into porting the runners onto the intake manifold to match the cylinder heads, will give you a higher amount of horsepower at top end up to redline, which is best to do, especially if you're on a budget. It's, no matter if you have a high-rise intake or a normal intake manifold, like a stock intake manifold from, like, let's say a truck intake manifold, you have low-end power, you can actually give it that more extra top-end power, horsepower, around, like, usually around 3,500 and up. So that's the basic onto the intake manifold. Now I'm going to give you guys the part we use for this 351 now stroke 2048. I'm going to give you guys the part number for this intake manifold we use. Let's see here. All right, the intake manifold here. It's called a Speedmaster High-Rise Intake Manifold. Part number is called part number SDM-1-147-026. This intake manifold goes for $400. It gets the RPM level of between 3,500 and 8,000 RPM. And in this case, it's a situation for the stroker kit and running in the camshaft up to 6,000 RPM. This intake manifold is able to help us push hard on horsepower and torque all the way to red line RPM at 6,500 RPM. But these intake manifolds are good for, like, bigger block engines, like, you know, the 429s and up. They use put higher RPMs. But in this case, we're only going to go for 6,500 because this is going into a 64 Shelby Cobra that only weighs, you know, about 2,300 pounds. So we can't push it too much. You can also get it port matched on those intake manifolds for about like $150 to $250 to your local shop, or maybe $50 in Dremel tools. You can go try to do it yourself. So that's pretty much it as far as the block goes. How we made the 408 cubic inch stroker to make 560 horsepower. The other thing to talk about as well, I would say verbally, is since we're running 11.8 to 1 compression ratio, now static compression ratio usually at 11 to 1 and up, you want to run at least 93 and up. You're going to have to. It's just no choice. Because how much timing you're going to have to run. The other thing to do you can as well, besides running race gas, since race gas is so expensive, some even pay even $10 a gallon. The next thing you can try to do is run an EFI system. Sure, it might cost you about $2,000 on the long haul, which we did in this situation here. Was you're able to run on the EFI system, you're able to run E85, and that's what we ended up doing. And the E85 will be a lot cheaper. You can run around, especially in Arizona, it's about $2.50 to $3 a gallon. But the only problem is it's going to burn 30% faster. However, you're able to manage to be able to handle that high compression engine or running in forced induction applications. So after that, the only thing we did, guys, was actually just put long tube headers into the system, and that was it. It was actually custom headers from Summit Racing. We had an order for the Shelby Cobra. It was reverse headers. You can see in the pictures later. Where we're able to make it fit without any clearance issues, without the tire actually hitting the header. So that'll be it for that. So this is it for part 2, guys. Part 3 is when I come up, we're going to talk about how the clearance we did for the transmission and the drive shaft.